Good morning. I'm Barbara Galani. I'm Director of Communication Engagement and Cooperation at EFSA. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all the people who are here to this very, very popular breakout session, all the people that are following us online. And I'd like to welcome my co-chair, moderator, speakers, who will also be the panelists for the rest of the session. The Engaging with Society session is divided in two parts. So we got the morning, we got the afternoon with a slightly different feel. And it's great to have an audience that can offer their views and expertise from so many different angles. As we have so much experience in the room, we will rely on technology to share it. And we'll also have a moderator to really get out of you the things that concern you, the things that are going through your mind as we discuss the challenges and the opportunities of engaging with society. So we will be able to use the event app. You might have become familiar over the past couple of days with the app. And you can use it to submit your comments, to ask questions, to vote for the contents submitted by others. And we will feature your views during the discussions and try to address some of the points that you raise. Now, to test this approach and to get to know each other, I would like to invite you to use the app now and to upload it. It takes a few seconds, sometimes with all of us connecting simultaneously, it takes a little bit longer. So if I see a little bit of shuffling, I'm going to be very, very pleased because you're getting your phone out. And I've got a question for you. It's the first poll for the day, just to get an idea of who is in the room and how we're going to deal with the questions and dialogue that we're going to start. So, which of the following organizations or groups are you representing? Risk assessment or regulatory bodies? University or research institutes? The private sector? Civil society? Press or media? Or other? So, I'll give you a few seconds to choose the option. I see some of you still working, uploading, considering. And it would be great if we could close the vote now and have it displayed on the screen. Okay, so about half of us in the room are risk assessors or regulators. Just less than 30% researchers or university, and 20% private sector, small percentage of civil society, some colleagues from the press and the media. So it's quite an interesting distribution. It's very much linked to the topics that are dealt with in the whole conference. And as I said at the beginning, it's quite interesting to have an engaging with society topic that we can discuss with people coming from so many different angles. And sometimes we fall into the trap of trying to address issues with engagement with society through a pure information deficit approach. But we've all realized in our professional careers that providing accurate information is, of course, necessary, but it's not enough. And if we want to effectively manage the science-society relationship, we need to really work on public participation, and this is not a simple task. We have seen this at EFSA with our public consultations during the processes of forming scientific opinions. And I'm really keen to hear the experience of others and the experience of experts. So we're here today to reflect on, to learn from, and why not also to challenge what some of the leading experts have to say on these topics. And all of this will give us a clearer idea at the end of the day about where we should focus our efforts to optimize public engagement. Now, in terms of the session, in the morning we will be focusing on how science-society relations are formed and on related information and communication challenges for scientific institutions and regulatory bodies. And as 49% of us are working for regulatory bodies and scientific institutions, plus another 27% on academia and research, I bet there will be a lot of note-taking and a lot of reflection. The afternoon part will expand on public engagement, observing it within the contemporary societal and political context. And we have developed the afternoon based on case studies and examples from practitioners. We will have a co-chair and a chair system moderator to shape our discussions. And at this stage, I would like to present Ellen Voss, who will be co-chairing the session with me. Ellen is Professor of European Law at the Law Faculty of Maastricht University. She is co-director of the Maastricht Center for European Law of Maastricht University and the Center for European Research in Maastricht. She wrote and obtained a PhD in law at the European University Institute in Florence, so familiar with the Italian culture. And Ellen's main areas of interest are European law and governance, including comitologies and agencies, market integration, and EU risk regulation. This includes precautionary principle, food safety, pharmaceuticals, and a number of controversial issues such as nanotechnology. I'm really pleased to share the responsibility of keeping the speakers on track for the rest of the morning with Ellen. Before I hand over to Ellen, I would like to ask you again to open the app. Should be a little bit of a faster process now. We're really getting into the gist of things. And to tell us, in your opinion, which is the biggest challenge for engaging with society? A, people have different interests and concerns. B, platforms for engagement are limited. C, the complexity of science. D, issues are already distorted or polarized. E, lack of trust in authorities and science. And F, other. Please don't vote too much for other, or we'll find it a little bit difficult to address your concerns. So just a few seconds maybe to just read the options and decide. And we can now close the vote and see what the audience thinks. So we got quite a good spread here. The front runner is issues are already distorted or polarized, followed very, very closely by the lack of trust in authorities and science. We talked about trust, trustworthiness in the opening session, and I expect the speakers will expand on this. People have different interests and concerns, complexity of science, and platforms for engagement are limited. So quite a broad spectrum of views, and I can promise that we'll try and address some of those together this morning. So I'd like to ask Ellen to take over from me and to introduce the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Barbara. We have today very interesting and exciting papers, presentations on communication and the difficulty of communicate. So I would like to invite the first speaker, Masmiane Bouki, to come to the floor. And Masmiane Bouki is a professor of science and technology in society at the University of Trento. He has been also visiting professor in various academic and research institutes in Asia, Europe, North America, and Oceania, and is the editor of the International Journal Public Understanding of Science. I would like to welcome your presentation, and your presentation is called Quality of Information, Public Engagement, and the Challenges of Science Communication 2.0. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the invitation, and good morning, everybody. I think we are all aware of the challenges in general terms of the quality of information and public engagement. But today I'm going to try a different kind of exercise with you to face these challenges. I'm going to start with a little bit of history. Oh, this is cut. It looked better when I checked it on. Is there anything we can do? Okay, good, fine. So I'm starting from what I've called the good old days with a question mark, because of course it's easy to be nostalgic about the past, especially today, but I'm not sure we should be nostalgic. Anyway, this is almost exactly 1 century ago. This is from the front page of the New York Times. And this was when the news of the confirmation of the first empirical confirmation of the general theory of relativity, a theory which had been much discussed and criticized by physicists until then around the world. Einstein was systematically denied the Nobel Prize for 10 years, for at least 10 years. So what happened in 1919 was that after this solar expedition, Einstein and his theory became front-page news. But the most interesting part of this article is in the middle, actually towards the end, which describes this theory as a book for 12 wise men, something probably Einstein himself said. He was surprised. So much excitement about something so difficult that only 12 people in the world could probably understand. So this is exactly the cornerstone of 20th century science communication. Science is so complicated, you need a mediator for the general public. You need professionals to explain. Sometimes a metaphor, a rather problematic metaphor, I think, but a very common and widespread metaphor is the metaphor of translation. And so we came to something like this. Don't worry, it looks complicated, but it's not. Science communication can be described, I'm still talking about 20th century, of course, as a continuum of communication from the interspecialistic levels, which means the very specialized journals, the very specialist conferences, plasma physics, for example, particle physics, high energy physics, and so on. Then there is an interspecialistic stage, if you know journals like Nature and Science, and only part of the issues and the questions discussed at the very specialistic stage come to that level. Then there is a pedagogical stage. Thomas Kuhn, when he wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolution, he spoke about textbook science. Where do we look for the solid rock, the state of the art of a certain field? We don't go to conferences. We'd have to go into textbooks. Textbooks are the photograph of what, for example, a student should learn. And then is the popular stage. Only very few of the theories and results actually reach the general media or the public or the front page of the New York Times or BBC Primetime or a science museum. So there is a process of dilution. And at the same time, what is important about this process, it's a sequential process. So it's a hierarchical to some extent, but it's a sequential process. First, you have the discussion among the specialists, then the specialists more or less agree on some theory or results, and then through this dilution process, something comes to the general public. Can we all agree with that? I think it's not so complicated. So let me Let me move on towards the present. Of course, when we think about the present, we mostly think about the technologies of communication and digital technologies and how much they have changed the landscape of communication and science communication. But I'm sure, especially those of you who work in research center, are aware of this phenomenon, which for science communication is at least as equally important, which is what I have briefly, very roughly described here as the third mission push. I'm quoting two documents here. One is about public engagement from an organization in the UK, but the first one is actually from a very important document at the European level, which is the European Charter for Researchers and the Code of Conduct for the recruitment of researchers. What does this document say? And this is something which is largely new. Is saying that every research organization, not just has the duty of producing new knowledge and transferring this new knowledge to the new generation of students, but also has a duty to convey and actually discuss openly as possible, the results of her or his research with the general public. And actually, direct engagement with the public will help researchers to better understand public interest in priorities for science and technology and the public concern. So this contributes to create a certain landscape. Now, let me hold on this for a second. Now, if we put this push to go directly to the public in the context of contemporary media technology, of course, these two things get together. So I played a little trick here, and I went, there are these time machine websites where you can look at how a website looked 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I did this, it's very simple. I think you can do it by yourself for other research organizations, to the website of CERN, the European Organization for Particle Physics. And this is how on the left, how it looked in 1997, the website. So it's very basic. There are barely the indications to get there. It's just for the scientist and maybe for a journalist who wants to know a little bit more about. 2007, it already looked a little bit more appealing also to the general public. And this is today. For example, on the homepage, you have an image which is about science and art. CERN has an extensive project about science and art, so engaging with the public, connecting physics with science. And this is the Facebook page. Now, Facebook pages have categories, and the Facebook page of CERN is Art and Entertainment in Geneva. So I have called, again, I understand we don't have much time here, so you understand I'm using a little bit of simplification, but I'm using this metaphor from business called this science communication direct to consumer, which means that organizations like CERN nowadays, they do not have to rely anymore exclusively on the mediation of journalists or professional mediators or professional communicators or traditional media, but they can offer to the general public directly a variety of communication instruments to talk about the research, games for children, video, presence in social media, interviews with the researchers, and so on. Let's wait a minute. One of the questions we have in this age of digital communication when it comes to science, and something which we don't know much about, because of course for big companies like Facebook or Google, it's very easy to count, or Twitter, it's very easy to count the numbers. It's very good for them to say millions of people have watched this video or millions of people have visualized this news, but what does it actually mean? What use do people make? For example, Facebook counts a video as seen if people have watched it for 6 seconds. What does that actually mean? There is an old theory, not so old actually, from the 70s in communication, which is the theory of uses and gratifications. To know what people do with media content is probably even more important than to know how many people have clicked on a certain thing. So with our Science in Society monitor, which has been running on for almost 20 years, also in cooperation with other international, with other organizations in other European countries, we tried to ask, among other questions, something about the use and the perception of what people read or see about science and technology on the digital media. So this is a question, for example, about trustworthiness. And a first interesting hint is that people consider what they see on the web and social media about science and technology more credible compared to what they see about, for example, economy or national and international politics. Of course, we could long discuss why this is so. But how do they evaluate the reliability when they see something on Facebook about vaccination or about particle physics? We say in Italy, or probably also in other languages, you can see the glass half empty or half full. Here is that the interesting thing is that 40%, almost 41, do not rely, for example, on those who have shared, who has sent this to me or who has conveyed this information to me, but on the original source. For example, whether it comes from a respected or trustworthy science institution or research institution. How widespread are the so-called fake news on the web and social about, in general, and about science and technology related issues? Again, people think that they are a little bit less widespread. And who is responsible? This is also interesting. The responsibility is mostly placed on the traditional mediators. It is journalists, then it's also, of course, people who share the news. And let me draw your attention to the point, researchers and doctors providing data. It's not so big, it's less than 1 out of 10 of our respondents, but I will come back to that point, which I think it's a rather interesting one. And then, of course, 20% think it's Facebook and the other companies. They do not have a mission like the New York Times to provide accurate information. They just want to make money with our data and with our clicks. We came up with, we did a cluster analysis of this series of questions. I don't have much time here to comment in detail, but we identified 2 dominant clusters, a moderate user of news on social media about science and technology, and what we call more suspicious. And interesting, those who use it more were actually normally younger, less scientifically literate, less educated. They are more suspicious. So they look more at news about science and technology on social media, but at the same time, they are more critical. So let me come to another point. I mentioned the relationship of trustworthiness with the original source. These are 2 blogs by 2 physicists about string theory. String theory is a theory in theoretical physics, which has been quite widespread and supported by many physicists. These 2 physicists are rather critical about this theory. So one is calling his blog The Trouble with Physics, and the one on the left is actually saying something which is probably the most negative thing you can say about a theory. It's not even wrong. You cannot even prove it wrong, so it's not even scientific. Now, imagine yourself, you are a physics teacher. What are you going to teach? Are you going to teach string theory? Or are you going to show your students, and they might come to these pages anyway, this controversy which is taking place in real time, at the same time when the public communication of physics is going on? Remember, we started from this, but this is flattening increasingly. science and scientific controversy and controversy at the edge are happening increasingly under our eyes. So, let me sum up with, of course, again, it's a great deal of simplification, and I apologize for that, what I call the quality challenge and the crisis of mediators. Now, of course, what I'm presenting here are what we call in sociology ideal types. In reality, we know that traditional media have not disappeared. We always live in a combination of these two words, but just for analytical purposes. So science communication 1.0, the one I showed at the beginning, was a communication mediated and filtered. What were the key actors? Mostly professional mediators, journalists, people working in science museum, doing the selection for us, or what they thought was interesting and trustworthy, and try to explain it in easier terms. Sometimes scientists, of course, were also involved. The relation between the specialist level and the public communication level was vertical and sequential. What was the quality assurance device? How did we detect the quality of science communication? Well, basically through the brand, through the reputation of the brand. If it's on the BBC, if it's on the Corriere della Sera, if it's in the Science Museum, then it must be something interesting and trustworthy. Now, science communication 2.0, it's dominated by a direct-to-consumer trend. CERN is bringing its results, its activities, directly to the general public. Who are the main actors? Research institutions, scientists, and of course, those who make money out of this business, the big digital media corporations. Now, one of the questions is, are these actors prepared to take such new responsibility? Are the scientists prepared to do what the code of conduct is asking them to do, for example? What is the relation between the specialist discussion and public communication level? It's not anymore vertical, sequential, but it's horizontal, simultaneous, overlapping. We had a spectacular example of this back in 2009 when the email of climate researchers were hacked. So even the most private level of communication was exposed and made available to the general public. Now I have a question for you. I'm sorry I don't have a straightforward answer for this. What are the quality assurance devices in science communication 2.0? And talking about quality, I'm not talking only about accuracy. And this is one of the reasons I don't like to use this widespread term, fake news. Accuracy is certainly one of the dimensions of quality, but it's not the only one. Let me go back to the CERN example. What is CERN giving us on the web page or on the social media? Is it the state of the art of particle physics or its self-promotion of their own activities, which is perfectly legitimate, but of course, it's a different type of communicative aim. So this I think, should be part of how we reflect on the quality of communication, which includes transparency, for example, of aims, and a series of elements which go beyond just the question of is it accurate or not. The role of scientists is interesting, of course, in this communication game, not just they become to be a protagonist, but because we know very much that on the internet and social media, the authority, a very good way or a very widespread way, actually, of raising the profile of what you have to say, whatever you say, it's to anchor it to somebody who's very famous and considered trustworthy. So, for example, there was an interesting paper a few years ago about all sorts of things that Einstein is attributed on the internet and then he never said, including the famous one on bees. You know this quote that when bees will disappear, the humanity will be in danger. He never said that. But of course, these things spread and perpetuate because there is a sort of mix-up. As scientists, also one of the reasons is that there's a confusion between a scientist that said that and it's scientific. Another thing we often discuss today, and this is why I think history is important, because we tend to think that some of the challenges we have to face are completely new, which of course is not true. For example, mystification for propaganda is not a new phenomenon, and scientists have taken part in that substantially in a number of occasions. This is the so-called Manifesto of the 93. This was signed by the most visible scientists of the time in Germany, including 7 Nobel laureates. And this manifesto, this is the German original version, and this is the English. Yes, you see, every paragraph is starting with, "It's not true." And they are denying matter of facts, completely denying, for example, the fact that Germany had invaded Belgium. So that's an enormous case of mystification for propaganda involving scientists for patriotic political reasons. So it's always been there. Of course, the communication landscape is changed. I mentioned before that some of our interviewees say it's not the social media, it's not the journalists, it's actually the scientists who are putting the garbage in the box of communication. So I'm just mentioning some, I think you know some of these figures. We have a problem nowadays, we have several problems in research. One is the problem of publication retractions, which have increased over 1,000% in the last 10 years. These are figures from just one data set, which is the Medline data set. And of course, retraction, you know what it means, no? It means a paper which has been proved to be fabricated or completely misleading in its conclusions and has to be retracted by the journal. But retractions, if you look at Retraction Watch, which is this very, very famous and active blog, it's always an underestimation because not all the fabricated papers get retracted. We have a phenomenon of predatory journals. I'm sure you get in your email, if you are a researcher, every week, some of these emails trying to persuade you to publish in these dubious journals. And then we have a problem of lack of replication. If you know the study by Ioannidis and his colleagues, not that many results, for example in medicine, get actually replicated. So here are 2 cases, and I'm getting to my conclusions. One is on the bottom part is the famous Obokata scandal, paper published in Nature about stem cells, happened to be fabricated by this doctoral student, and the scandal was so big, the head of the laboratory committed suicide in Japan. And the one on top is a paper published in Science from the University of Uppsala last year. And this paper had a very appealing conclusion for the media, which partly relates to the question of food, which is that our seas are so polluted that the fishes now prefer to eat plastic than what they traditionally used to eat. So this paper made headline news everywhere. The BBC dedicated a lot of space, but this paper actually happened to be fabricated. The evidence was not there. Now, again, I'm sorry, I don't have answers. I have questions for you. Who is responsible for this example of poor quality science communication? Is it the BBC who reported about it? Is it the social media who gave a lot of emphasis to this paper? Or is the University of Uppsala and Science who actually in the first place made it possible for this paper to be published? And this is the end. If you wish to discuss this a little bit more, I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Massimiliano. You raise a lot of food for thought and for discussion, hopefully. Before I give the floor to the audience for questions, I would like to remind everyone that we do the same format as the last 2 days, namely that you can pose questions throughout also the presentations in the app and also through Twitter. So who could I give the floor? And maybe, yes, okay, then you immediately question, yeah. Can you please present yourself and then pose your question? Yeah, thank you very much.
Hello, Les Fairbank from the EFSA GMO panel. In the UK, and I'd like your comment on this, but my feeling is that one of the drives for the kind of result that you've just shown is the push for scientists to be more impactful. So there's a lot of pressure on the academics to exaggerate the truth of what is in the paper.
Yes, I think there are also studies about. You mean, for example, the science paper? These examples, yeah. Yes, there are studies and discussion which say one of the elements who may play an important role is the very strong pressure, especially on young researchers nowadays, to publish quickly and to emphasize the result. But this actually connects also with the third mission, push. Of course, there is a pressure also on the organization to raise the visibility of the results of the researchers. This is why I'm saying, of course, we should pay attention to the role of technology and digital technology, but it's not the only thing which is going on. There's important things which connect, of course, and find a new media ecology which is very suitable for them, but there's a very strong pressure for research organizations to promote what they are doing. And I'm not saying, as a sociologist, I'm not judging whether this is positive or negative, but certainly has consequences. I'm the editor of a journal which is called Public Understanding of Science, and I strongly recommend for you to read the paper by our German colleagues. It's called When Science Becomes Too Easy. And they do a very interesting reflection on, you're probably familiar with these fashionable formats like TED, FameLab, 3 Minutes, Breaking Walls. So the question they raise is, of course, this is very fine, but what kind of image are we conveying, for example, to young people in the long term? Is it the idea that science is something quick and spectacular that anybody can do with a little bit of preparation? Because if we have to be honest, we should also convey the idea that science is something difficult, that takes a lot of time, can be boring, can be discouraging. So I think we live in very interesting times, and we should be careful in the conclusion that we draw.
Okay, thank you. I would like to give the floor to collect a couple of questions and then give you the final word still. Yes, thank you. There's.
Hey, good morning. My name is Anandis Michalopoulos. I'm a journalist for Euractiv.com in Brussels. I just wanted to ask you a question. We're talking about the communication of science, but thinking about the glyphosate debate in Europe, I can tell you that the mess was basically created by the divisions within the scientific community. So I don't see the role of a journalist there, to be honest with you. I don't see the role of a mediator to deliver a message which is not a joint message by the entire scientific community. So what's the role of the journalist in this occasion?
Okay, other questions? Yeah, over there.
Peter Gerner-Schmidt, Centers for Disease Control in the United States. I think there's one thing that you might have forgotten to think about, and that is when we as scientists are communicating with the public, we are actually already being moderated by our own institution, because we are not allowed to talk directly to the public without having it cleared by our institution. So there's already a political bias when we start talking to the public.
Okay, I look at the time. Please post your questions via the app and the Twitter, but I need to close already. Yes, please, Massimiliano.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your name, but I fully agree with you. I think this resonates with what I said. I think the question is not, are scientists more controversial nowadays than they used to be? The question is, their disagreement is immediately visible to the general public. So that is, it's a different kind of game that we used to play. Traditionally, the discussion, the heated discussion and controversies among scientists were happening in what Erving Goffman would call the backstage of science communication. Now they're happening potentially under the eyes of the public. And this, of course, might have consequences. And with regard to your question, I'm not sure I understood. I mean, any scientist could open a blog like the professors I have shown and say whatever they want. I don't think their universities are policing. There was an interesting case, at least in some countries. There was an interesting discussion in Canada, if I remember, a few years ago, where the government didn't or had a proposal not to allow researchers, for example, to speak about climate change science. But I would say this is it's a rather specific case, and it was very controversial. I don't see how you can, except of course maybe in China or in certain contexts, you can not allow a researcher to put something on the internet and say whatever they want, either about the research or about something else, which leads us to, may lead us again to the confusion between is scientific or it has been said by a scientist.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have already to close this session, this discussion, but of course we continue to come back to these issues in the rest of the morning. So thank you very much, Massimiliano. I then would like to invite Ragnar Lufstad to come and give the presentation. Ragnar Lufstad is a professor of risk management and director of King's College Centre of Risk Management in London. He also he teaches and conducts research on risk communication and management. He was also instructor at the Harvard Center of Risk Communication Challenge and course for continuing education professionals. And he is also visiting professor at the Center for Public Sector Research, Gothenburg University in Sweden. Ragnar will talk about conceptualizing and communicating risk in the post-trust societies. Please, Ragnar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you, EFSA, for inviting me today. It's great being back here in Parma, Italy. What a beautiful location. There you go. The title of my talk is Conceptualizing and Communicating Risks in Post-Trust Societies. What I will do today, if this works, you never know these technology, you know, I'm telling you, there you go. Provide an introduction of how people perceive risks, A. B, how these theories and ideas led to the growth in the development of risk communication programs. C, explain that risk communication is still very difficult to do. And if Ellen allows me, give some case study examples, but only if we have time, otherwise we don't. And then I put forward some policy recommendations. Now, first point is heuristics and biases, and the batteries here is dying, I think. Here we go. And I'm not going to discuss this because Alusha, our next presenter, will be discussing this. All I want to say, please read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Buy that book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And Lucia will explain in more detail why in her next talk. There you go. So no overlap here. Also, work from people like Baruch Fischoff, Paul Slovic, and Sarah Lichtenstein in the 1970s and 80s described how people perceive risks differently. For example, natural vis-a-vis technological. Natural hazards are seen to be an act of God. Technological hazards are seen to be an act of human. We worry much more about technological hazards than natural ones. I remember doing my PhD at Clark University many years ago. I'm now old and fat. And basically, at the time when I was a PhD student, we had undergraduate students going to the Florida Keys. I said, why are you going to the Keys for? What's going on the Florida Keys? But Ragnar, we have a hurricane coming in. I said, so? But it's hurricane party time. I said, what do you mean hurricane party time? We're going to go down there and party a hurricane. So they basically went down there, got a flat, bought a few bottles of rum, and partied a hurricane, and they thought that was a great experience. Do you think anybody in their right mind would party a nuclear power accident? The answer to that is no. The issue between natural and technological hazards. We also have voluntary, involuntary hazards. We worry 1,000 times more about involuntary hazards than basically voluntary hazards. We take voluntary risks all the time. We go skiing, we go skydiving. We like the thrill of that. We don't like, however, to have basically a mobile telephone mast sited next to our daughter's bedroom window. That's an involuntary risk, and we hate that. We worry more about risks that are seen to be non-familiar than risks that are familiar. We are afraid of basically the fear of the unknown. We worry more, for example, about bird flu, swine flu, than we do about ordinary flu, because we have no idea what's going to happen with bird flu. Will we have the next Spanish flu? We want to be in control at all times. We hate when we're not being in control. Therefore, when you are with your loved one, you want to drive that car. You don't want your loved one to do it. And when you're not driving that car, what happens to you? You become a backseat driver. You tell your loved one, you're going too fast, you're going too slow. While you're in second gear, indicate now. Familiar? Yes. We worry more about low-frequency, high-consequence risks than we do about high-frequency, low-consequence risks. We worry more about airplane accidents than we do about car accidents. Although, of course, car accidents are happens much more often. For example, I gave a talk at the Federal Aviation Authority in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago. And I asked them basically, what would happen if we had the same number of people dying in airplanes than we do in cars in the United States, which is, by the way, 35,000 individuals per year. And FAA said, Ragnar, that's not a funny question. I'm saying, I'm not trying to be funny, I'm just a humble professor. And they said, so what would you do? I said, you know what they told me? They said they would close down US airspace. Can you believe that? So you've had 35,000 people dead per year in the US from airplane accidents. They closed down the airspace. But we humbly accept 35,000 people dead a year in car accidents. Discuss. Find it fascinating. According to work by Jennifer Lerner, women worry more about risks than men. We worry more about risks that affect kids than don't affect kids. And we want to be treated fairly at all times. Therefore, it's easier to site wind power stations in Sweden and Denmark when the wind farms are owned by the local municipality than, for example, in Scotland when they're owned by a multinational corporation such as Vattenfall or EDF. And by the way, I hope you find this talk interesting. Do you? I see some happy faces. They're not happy I'm here at, I got here at crack of dawn. I'm not a morning person. I can't stand mornings. There you go. And the battery needs to be replaced. Next one, here we go. So because of this rise of the so-called psychometric paradigm, this led to the development of risk communication programs, primarily led by United States-based consultants regarding to site and build nuclear power plants, to site nuclear waste facilities such as Yucca Mountain in Nevada, build waste incinerators, and convince the public that certain foods are safe. 3 types of strategies were put forward, so-called top-down risk communication, where I stand on a podium and talk down to you. Dialogue communication, where I sit with Lucia or somebody in the audience and have a chat with her about whether we should have a incinerator here or not. Or bottom-up risk communication, we take a local issue and you scale it up to a national level or an international level. Yet, risk communication is still very difficult to do. For example, you have the so-called social amplification and attenuation of risk by medias and other bodies. For example, murders are amplified, suicides are attenuated, depression is attenuated. And I find this completely fascinating, okay? So I'm Swedish, but I've been living now in the UK for more than 25 years. Now I'm gonna give talks, especially in Germany. I have no idea why. People come up to me and say, Ragnar, how are you Swedes like? You're always so depressed. You're all a bunch of alcoholics, and you all kill each other. And I think to myself, what? Where do you get these numbers from? The Swedes are very civilized individuals, almost like the Dutch are, for crying out loud. And we don't kill each other, and we aren't more alcoholic than anybody else. Actually, the worst is further east. I'm not going to mention any countries. And it turns out, our friends in Germany have been reading Henrik Mankell and watching the Wallander series. And the Wallander series is very big in Germany, and it's basically all about depressive people killing each other. As a result, that has been amplified in the German psyche. And frankly, I find it fascinating. You also have the so-called narrative approach, where we find that people like stories and they like anecdotes more than numbers. Julie Downs from Carnegie Mellon discusses that. And of course, we also have deliberation, trying to engage with the public, something that Ellen will discuss this afternoon. This is very, very important. But a problem, of course, you have here is self-selection bias. Case in point, a number of years ago, I was involved with reciting a waste incinerator in the North Black Forest in Germany. And we wanted to get people involved in so-called citizen panels. We asked 5,440 people to get involved, and how many decided to be involved to participate 6 months, once a week, Wednesdays, 7 to 9 p.m. You want to guess? It's too big an audience. I'll tell you. Out of 5,440 individuals, 193 people decided to participate. What did they have in common? Were they for or against incinerator? Tell me. They were against, thank you very much, they were against incinerator. Were they time poor or time rich? They were time rich. They were basically unemployed, they were pensioners, or basically they were students. There you go. Then we also have optimistic bias. For example, people who smoke are not worried about smoking because they say, I'm not going to die of lung cancer, but that person down the road smoking will. My lungs are super lungs. I have Viking lungs. Very, very important, optimistic bias. Trust is also absolutely crucial in this discussion. High levels of public trust can equal low levels of public perceived risk, and vice versa. Low levels of public trust can equal high levels of public perceived risk. Trust can explain up to 50% of the public will perceive certain risks. 1992, July 1992, at the Barsebäck nuclear power station in Sweden, we had an incident where basically the outlet filters of the nuclear power station were blocked. As a result, this stopped basically the nuclear reactor being able to cool down. Thankfully, the operators in the plant were awake that morning, were able to basically activate the so-called backflush mechanism, and in a period of 25 minutes, the nuclear reactor was flowing normally again. But it's caused an international incident. The Danes, who are anti-nuclear power, are very, very upset about this and demanded basically that all nuclear reactors in Sweden should be closed, especially Barsebäck, which is located 20 kilometers away from Copenhagen, and basically had a war of words between the Prime Minister of Sweden and the Prime Minister of Denmark. And then, however, it died down. A year later, Barsebäck was reopened. I was then based at EFSA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, Austria. I decided to do a very much of a study on this topic where I interviewed 100 people, random telephone survey of folks in Malmö. When I asked these individuals in Malmö, do you think that basically Barsebäck is a safe nuclear power station? Of those 100 people, 60 individuals said yes. Then I asked them, open-ended question, why? And here I got the surprise of my life, and one of the reasons why I'm a full professor at King's College. Of those 60 people, 57 of them said, I think Barsebäck is safe because I trust Swedish industry. I was so surprised. Growing up in America, living in the UK, I would no way in Hades would I thought anybody would think that industry is trustworthy. But in the case in Sweden, they did. And if you think about it, yes, the chainsaw, the Husqvarna 444 chainsaw, which I have 2 of, and I'm a lumberjack in Sweden, I have 1,000 acres of forest there. They are the best chainsaws in the world. Maybe I understand some of that. But I find it absolutely fascinating. So there's a high correlation between high levels of public trust and low levels of public perceived risk. You also have a rise now of so-called post-trust societies. And Ellen, how much more time do I have? 8 minutes left, okay. So as a result, risk communication is getting more complicated. We have a number of regulatory scandals. Dioxins in Belgian chicken feed. We have tainted blood in France. We had mad cow disease in the UK and elsewhere. We also had the foot and mouth disease. These basically scandals should not be underestimated. The UK mad cow crisis, for example, was seen in the UK to be the biggest crisis since the 1956 Suez Canal, according to the Prime Minister at the time, John Major, while the EU Agriculture Commissioner at the time, Franz Fischler, viewed BSE mad cow as the biggest crisis the European Union had ever had. And on top of that, we had basically the collapse of the financial markets in 2008, caused by basically the downfall of Lehman Brothers in New York. Excuse me. So as a result, because of these scandals, the regulatory model in many parts of Europe has changed. We have moved from a so-called consensual style regulation, where decisions were taken behind closed doors, which involved elites very much, and unfortunately I used the old boys, unfortunately networks, and NGOs were not much listened to much more adversarial style regulation, which is much more open and transparent, where stakeholders and representatives of civil society are consulted, where media and social media play a much greater role. They basically, in many ways, are actually driving the debate. And here's a quote from the UK Strategy Unit in 2002 on risk management, where I say, quote, "Departments and agencies should make earning and maintaining public trust a priority in order to help them advise the public about risks they may face. There should be more openness and transparency, wider engagement of stakeholders and the public, wider availability of choice, and more use of arm's-length bodies, such as the Food Standards Agency, to provide advice on risk decisions," end of quote. So a complete change from consensual to more adversarial. There are, however, of course, cultural and national differences. The UK is more representative of post-trust societies than Sweden, and you look at the very aggressive UK media, especially the dreadful Daily Mail, a newspaper I cannot simply stand. It's basically an awful newspaper. You don't have that to the same degree in Sweden. There's also, of course, less trust in eastern parts of Germany than the western parts of Germany, according to research by Frederick Badder et al. And populist politicians feed on post-trust societies. That's why I think we have Brexit in the UK, and I hope it will never happen, by the way. And that's why there's a rise in popularity in Sweden with the Swedish Democrats. So I'm not going to have time for case studies. I don't have time. No, we have 5 more minutes. Well, basically, I'll give you just very briefly then, because I heard a question earlier. So issues in European debate on the safety of pesticides and plasticides, bisphenol A, glyphosate, neonicotinoids. This is a very adversarial debate. We have pluralism on science, something that our question referred to earlier. Between various scientists not agreeing on the safety of these issues. We have a debate between industry, we have a debate between civil society, we have a debate between regulators. I know EFSA is very much involved in this, and other stakeholders. It's very messy, and it's part of this post-trust society thing. But very clear, however, also in less post-trust societies, risk communication can also be difficult. For example, the Swedish 2016 to 2017 Campylobacter scare. What happened there, for more than 6 months, the Swedish Food Agency and agricultural agencies refused to publicly reprimand Sweden's largest producer of broilers, called Kronfågel, over its mishandling of Campylobacter, because they wanted to have some kind of dialogue. They would have some kind of consensus instead. As a result, this led to up to 5-fold increases in Campylobacter poisoning among the Swedish population over this 9-month period. In a sum, basically, 100,000 extra individuals getting sick of Campylobacter in Sweden. So even in non-post-trust societies, risk communication can be difficult. So, recommendations. I feel that EFSA and other European agencies need to promote media guidelines, such as those developed by BBC, to ensure that they get their news stories right. And we as academics, all need to work with the media. The media these days are stressed out. There are fewer of journalists than ever before, because our youngsters, our kids are not buying newspapers, and we have to basically ensure they get the stories right. And we should do that in a proactive way. B, regulators and other bodies need to find critical friends who can both evaluate what the agencies are doing and speak on their behalf. Speaking to our friends at the US FTA and other bodies here in Europe, I feel far too many other regulators don't have critical friends, and we need to work on that and help them get critical friends. 3, we, the academic community, need to help regulators and policymakers to become better communicators. We should set up training courses, for example, to help them understand why people worry more about involuntary risks than voluntary ones. And going back to another question earlier, we should ensure that scientists themselves become more honest communicators. I find basically the PR departments at UK universities to be absolutely appalling at sometimes, where they basically take a story and really amplify it, focusing on some risk, when basically they shouldn't do that. I find it irresponsible, and I think we as academics need to become more responsible in basically controlling our news feed. We should promote the establishment of a genuine European Academy of Sciences, and we should put that in Strasbourg, by the way, so our politicians don't have to move from basically Brussels to Strasbourg once a month. And basically B, we should reestablish the chief scientist advisory position in the European Commission to discuss issues such as glyphosate and neonicotinoids. But then, rather than a staff of 4 people that Ann Glover have a staff of 50, and also at the same time involving Sam in that process. We should help regulators establish independent risk communication advisory boards, such as the ones that the US FDA has, and one that EFSA used to have. We should reestablish that again. We should help ensure that the regulators and other bodies pre-test their communication messages. I'm quite shocked, being an academic and trying to be evidence-based. In many cases, regulators put out a message in the public domain without pre-testing it. I find that basically irresponsible. That's something that we should be doing as well to ensure that message is absolutely correct. We should support the establishment of a formal working group on risk in the European Parliament. Maybe that should happen after the next European elections. And finally, my friends, and thank you for listening to me, ensure that the communication director within a regulatory agency is part of the executive function. The communications person has to be in the room when the decisions are being taken. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ragnar. There are a lot of recommendations being made, so maybe some of you is inspired to react on that. Can I give someone the floor? Otherwise, I would also like to ask you, Ragnar, whilst we're waiting for the rest of the questions, whether you seem to focus a lot on improving the quality of communication. But what about the other strategies that you mentioned in terms of, well, for example, deliberation? Is that something that would be... We have to
absolutely work.
Sorry, can I ask you to postpone your answer and collect a few other questions? Here, from the public, there is still another question by someone in the audience. In risk communication, would it be worthwhile to compare food risk with everyday life risk, like those in traffic? If so, what would be the best category of risk to compare with food risk to?
Well, that's a big question, and of course we should try to do comparisons as much as possible. However, for comparable risk communication, we should compare apples with apples and not apples with oranges. As a case in point is people sometimes say, you know what, this is no big deal. It's like being in a thunderstorm, being out in lightning. Well, it depends where you are in a lightning storm, okay? In this building, if you're in a lightning storm, it's no big deal. We don't care if it's a thunderstorm outside, do we? No. But I can tell you, if you have 2 daughters, and if you're fishing for perch in a lake in southern Sweden, in a rowboat in August, this is Ragnar 3 years ago, and all of a sudden you have a thunderstorm overhead, and there's lightning, you think you're going to die, well then you're very, very worried. So it really depends where you are. So I'm all for risk comparisons, also in the food sector, but do apple-to-apple comparisons and not apple-to-orange comparisons.
Okay, can collect. What about the question of improving the quality of communication rather than also, or is it and the deliberation aspect, for example? Can you elaborate on that?
Improving the quality of communication is absolutely crucial. We should do much more of that, and I think we should involve the public much more. Something I know you've been working on, Ellen, something that Orp and Ren has been working on. And I think basically there is a struggle going forwards, however, because we are being totally bombarded by doing more surveys this and more surveys that. We are more stressed out than ever before, and it's something we need to find a medium, we need to find a way on how to best to engage with the general public. It's something to be continued, and I'm sure, Ellen, you'll be discussing that this afternoon.
Okay. Other questions? There's here a question posed by a member of the audience. Are risk and uncertain communication different things? What type of research are needed for uncertainty communications?
Oh, that's something that Barbara can talk about in some detail. EFSA is doing quite a bit of work on uncertainty right now, and something I'm going to actually refer to EFSA. Do we have any people working on uncertainty from EFSA in the room? We want to address that question. Barbara, you want to address that question?
Sorry.
It's a lot of work on communicating uncertainties, and we developed first a guidance on evaluating uncertainties from a scientific perspective in a harmonized way. And then we realized that the communication is one of the biggest hurdles. So we had a very long process working with social scientists in a specific working group with scientists to develop a guidance on how to communicate on uncertainties. We had a public consultation that finished at the end of June. Colleagues that are present today in the room are analyzing the results of the consultation with the aim to improving it, and we will publish it very soon.
EFSA are the world leaders in terms of communicating uncertainty. So we're very much looking forward to seeing your final document on that.
Okay, there's another question from the public. I will just read them here. You appear to support a re-establishment of a chief scientific advisor position.
I knew I'd get that question.
Could you elaborate on this?
So basically, I think science should be in the public domain. We should basically ensure that the debate is led by evidence-based and risk-informed policy making as much as possible. Living now in the UK for more than 25 years, where you have a chief scientist position, basically, is sitting in the cabinet office, etc. I find that system really works. You have, for example, Mark Walport, it does discuss issues such anything from climate change to endocannabinoids, the previous one. Same thing with Patrick Valance, the present one. They are actively engaged in the scientific debate. They are supported by a staff of more than 50 individuals, and it actually works. I mean, they are participating actively in this debate. They're actively in the media. They're advising the Prime Minister. I'd like to see that also happening in the UK. It didn't work before because of issues of transparency, and Glover was accused for not being transparent enough, and I can't comment on that. There might be some truth to that, I don't know. But basically, I think if we have adequate resources, similar to the UK, of 50 plus individuals, I think that would be very, very useful to help to discuss issues such as glyphosate, discuss neonicotinoids, to help basically ensure that science is front and stage in those kind of very important policy discussions.
Okay, I think there could be a lot of discussion on this latter point, but I unfortunately need to close this question session, and I would like to thank Ragnar. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for the questions. Also, please continue posing them, and these also will be collected, so they will not be lost. I would like to introduce to you Lucia Reich. She's the next speaker, and she's a German behavioral economist and full professor for intercultural consumer research and European consumer policy at the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. She's also visiting professor at Friedrichshafen Zeppelin University and is currently working as principal investigator in several research projects. I would like to ask you to talk, in fact, Lucia, about biases, illusions, and noise, why providing scientific fact is good, but not enough.
Okay, it does not start. It does. Good morning. Thanks for having me. And I take 30 seconds of my precious time to thank this wonderful team here at EFSA. I don't think I've been to a conference for a long time that has been so well prepared and organized and very detailed. Thanks so much. So as you heard, I'm a behavioral economist, but I also do quite some work on different councils, and I'm sometimes pretty close to policy for good and worse, but always at arm's length, of course. So what I think I can contribute today is to give you some glimpses from where the research stands, and at the same time how that can be used in practical policy advice. And I want to do three things. One is to ask, how do people actually think about food tech? That's going to be short, unfortunately short. Second, how do people make choices? Which are the major informational pitfalls? And third, what can politics do? I'm going to be much less detailed than the previous speaker, and I think it's a very good fit, actually. How do people think about food tech? Unfortunately, when I looked into, together with my team and the Bioeconomy Council, where I'm a member of, the German one, there isn't really very much up-to-date pan-European data. So this is what we found back from 2010, which means the data is from 2007 and 8 and 9. And this is a bit unfortunate, because if we really want to communicate, we have to know who our targets are. We have to know exactly what the perceived risks are. And of course, there's tons of studies on like national studies, there's sometimes binational studies, very specific ones, but there's no general overview. So that's actually, I already start with a suggestion to keep that going and to work on that again. What I did bring to you is some data that is quite recent. One is from the German Agency for Risk Assessment. This is about willingness to buy. It's unfortunately in German, but it's very easy, a very easy slide. So the dark gray is yes, I would buy it, and the light gray is no, I would not buy it. And what you can see, if you go down, there's simply 4 categories. The first is surface sealing, the second is textile, the third is cosmetics, and the third is food. You find still today a finding that has been out there for a long time, which basically says the closer the perceived risks come to the body or even taken into the body, the less the products in that case are actually appreciated and approved. This is a finding that has been found in very different types of food technologies. Again, I realize that you cannot read the details, but I'm going to explain that to you. That's another up-to-date study on food innovation, again in Germany. And the question was, have you heard something of the following innovations? And the red one is, do you approve or do you have hopes in those technological innovations? And what we can see here is that moral knowledge, which is the yellow bar, does not necessarily influence perceived usefulness. And because that has been, in the earlier times, one hope that you just educate, you inform people, and they will learn about all those good things that can happen with them. It does happen in a few cases, but it's, for instance, what do we have? Precision farming. No? Not many people know it, but a lot of people seem to have positive hopes in it, but not in the big ones like GMO biotechnology. So this is very recent data. And this is, again, I excuse myself again for the German one, but this is very recent data. This is from this year. That's from our own academy, the Academy of Technical Science, where I'm a member of. We did a study on asking, actually the item was from the Eurobarometer. Thanks to science and technology, there will be more opportunities for future generations. So this is a general, not only confined to biotechnologies or to food technologies, more general question. And what we see is the development between 2001 and 2017, which is the one to the very right, the one with a red square around it. And without going into details, the important one is the green bar, which means I completely agree to that science and technology will bring more opportunities. And that has significantly, lowered to 50%. So there's something going on. Of course, we also looked into, why did this happen? What happened between 2013 and 2017? And we can, of course, speculate. But there is something out there. We need better data if we want to communicate well. That's my plea. Second, how do people actually make choices? And this is like my bread and butter job as a consumer researcher. We have long, also in consumer research and also in policy making, we have long worked with the information model. The information model is not wrong, but it doesn't apply to many consumers, to put it in very simple and short words. It applies to a specific type of consumers that are not always the same ones. We know there's always market mavens, people who really know a lot, want to know a lot for different reasons. We also know that it's situation dependent, and it will also depend on the question of how much people are involved. It does also depend on some socio-demographical variables, but not that much. So basically what I'm telling you here in a very condensed matter is that we are much less information seekers, and consumers tend much less strive to be well informed than the typical model, and also the typical model that's in the head of policymakers, and that's the interesting thing, assumes. So basically, the consumer science has shifted to another model, which is the empirically based model of how consumers actually act, which is a different one. We acknowledge that we make our decisions and form our attitudes based on biases. The previous speakers briefly mentioned some of them. And we use heuristics, which are like rules of thumb, to speed up the process. The power of context is immense. It really depends a lot when and how and under which circumstances, like physical circumstances, but also in whether you're in a group or an individual, whether you're online, whether you're offline. It matters not a little bit, it matters a lot. Actually, my colleagues from neuroscience, they claim that when you take a normal store visit, only about 10 or 20% of all cases of immediate choices, your prefrontal neural cortex is actually involved, also mine, which means like, cognitive processes are taking on. For the rest, it is habits, it's emotions, it's stimuli, it's what you're up to right at that moment. So it's a little bit different from the model of the sovereign consumer we've been working with for a long time. With very limited cognitive bandwidth, and information load is an issue. And actually, that's not a bad thing, because being cognitive misers is a pretty useful strategy of human beings, because we cannot pay attention to everything. We have to sort out what is salient to us. Like, some people might decide these bullet points are already beyond my cognitive bandwidth, so I'm going to leave the room. That's just fine. I mean, nobody can pay attention to all information and to all risks. On top, even if we want to follow up our preferences, we have limited self-regulation and limited self-control, and that depends heavily also from the context. I already said that involvement, social emotions, we are social animals. It plays a huge role what the social norms are in a decision situation. And then there's all these extra things such as stress, distraction, time poverty, whether we're hungry or not, whether we're tired or not, etc., etc. So what I would like to show you is that although we cannot always control all of that, we have to, if we want to communicate better, we have to have much, much better idea of where, how, and to whom actually to communicate. And there has been a book advertisement before, which I would fully endorse. Here's another book advertisement. That's from the recent Nobel laureate, Dick Thaler, who is one of the fathers of behavioral economics. That's my field. And behavioral economics, we work with, we try to find out how do people actually make decisions. And this is the follow-up book, already from 2008. This is how to use that knowledge into policy making. That has become quite, well, famous, maybe. And Kerstenstein has received something like the Nobel for, he's a legal scholar, the Holberg Prize this year. So this is something that people worldwide look to and increasingly tend to use. There is now nudge units in almost 200 governments using these ideas in over 200 countries worldwide. So this is something to at least check whether that might be working. And this is a little bit theory behind. And again, we have the book, the advertised book by Daniel Kahneman. So the whole idea, this is, I just picked some of our theories from consumer research, is that what I described to you, people actually decide and form preferences and attitudes with two systems. One is the system 2, which is the fast, intuitive heuristic system, and with system 1. System 2 is the slow, deliberative, what we actually try to get when we have those deliberative groups that we just talked about, reflective, semantic. It's not good or bad, this is how it is. A problem is that most of the communication that has been done in the last year, like political, I'm not talking about marketing, they know what System 1 is about political and consumer researchers, consumer organizations, has been heavily based on System 2. And this is not bad, but it's not enough. That's my point. And when you look into individuals are pretty complicated creatures. I mean, just asking what are the true preferences? Is that what people think they want? Is that what others think they want? That would be social preferences. Is that what algorithms think people want, like e-preferences? Is that, I could go on like that. It's not that clear. There's preference reversals and preference constructions right at time. That means even if you think preferences might be very stable, they're not. They're empirically not. There might be very basic values where it's worth to develop, but the actual preferences, like in polls or right in the shop, they're not very stable, can be influenced pretty easily. There's something called rational inattention. I already explained that. It's pretty rational to not pay attention to everything because attention comes with costs, with time, with energetic costs. You can actually measure it. Neuroscientists measure that. And then again, we have those decision errors. It's not really errors, as I hope to explain, but they're typically called errors, biases, that you're systematically making an error into a specific direction. Then something called noise, which is completely random. And heuristics, which are those rules of thumb that also are useful but might not always be the right thing to do. And there's about 250 biases that have been described in the literature. I'm not that sure of all of them. I mean, there's some really weird ones. But I think there's basically 4 of those such biases. Loss looms larger than gain, so-called loss aversion. Good looms larger than bad, optimism bias. Now is more attractive than later, so-called present bias. And me is more attractive than you. That's the so-called self-serving biases. So I think these are the big 4 when you look into the biases. The good news is if you want to get people's decision right, or if people themselves want to get it right, they are basically curable in the sense they can be debiased particularly through very broad framing. So tell the story in a different way. Put people in another context. Confront them with other ideas, and then they might be curable. This is not the case for noise. Noise is chance variability of decisions, and we have not put a lot of effort into studying those. It's happening right now. Again, Daniel Kahneman, together with Cass Sunstein and some other people, are looking into that. Here's, to get you an idea, the difference between those errors. So if you would have like such a target, the left one, the A, would be an accurate guess. The B would be a noisy guess, completely random. C is a bias, you see? I mean, that always, goes into one direction. And D is, of course, the worst, noisy and biased. Difficult. I'm not saying this is, a problem per se, but if you want to communicate a specific story, then you should be aware of it. Individuals are complicated. Groups are even more complicated. And typically, we live in groups. We form our preference in groups. We have deliberate groups that come up with proposals. And so there's cascade effects. If one group sometimes just follows the beliefs because another significant group has shown or is very outspoken of such beliefs. So there's cascade effects in beliefs that might be based on so-called SIFs, supposedly irrelevant factors. One of them could be the distribution of beliefs, pro or con nuclear energy, pro or con GMO food in a group. And this is pretty, should not, in a rational way, should not make a difference, but it is. There's a lot of increasing work now on group polarization, because what we know from those deliberative groups, they tend to polarize. They tend not to converge, like on a compromise. Very often, they tend to polarize. Then there's also what I also found interesting is to look at norm entrepreneurs. These are people who are trying deliberately to challenge existing social norms and to change them. Like, coming up with a completely different storyline. There's some research on how that can happen and who could do that. I'm going to skip the next one. If someone is interested, like my co-author, Cass Sunstein, he's right now writing on a book on those things, and I think he knows a lot about it. Now, what can politics do? As I said, I'm much more maybe fuzzy than the prior speaker, so thanks to him. We don't need more information, I think we need better information. Easy to understand. Of course, it must be right. Yeah? Attractive, informative, meaningful, timely. When do we actually promote those, provide this information? It seems not to matter, it matters a lot. Cater for both. You remember those two systems, the peripheral and the central information processing. So information should not be too complicated, but also not too simple. And again, we have to know who's who in order to be successful. Use a stepwise approach to communication. We have seen from the opening speech this morning that there's different levels of how communication and knowledge is distributed. Another thing, or another approach could be to think first, maybe talk or try to explain the technology and then only go to the products. This is, could be a good strategy. I think disclosure, I know there's a lot about a debate about labels and disclosure. I think they are important because they do give people, consumers, a sense of control. At the same time, they are a safety signal, and we just heard how important it is that people feel the agency, feeling in control. And then it's still, we're a free market economy. People can still choose what they want. And then use framing. We talked briefly about prospect theory, loss aversion. There's many reasons, but there is one reason maybe why, particularly when you ask for the acceptance for GMO food and GMO medicine, that the acceptance of medicine is so much higher. As I said, there's many reasons. One of them could be that the medicine is about reduction of loss. And a lot of the food stuff is more about improved nutrition. So why not try to change things? Kind of try the loss frame. It's my last slide. And surprise, surprise, I think it's not going to go without more trust. We'll help develop trust by cooperating with trustworthy institutions as senders. We've seen how important the sender effect is and platform hosts. In our the opening poll this morning, I did not see, maybe there was this 1% people from consumer organizations or, independent bodies. That would be very good to have them on board. This is what we did. I helped put up which is called Nanoportal BW. It's from a German land, Baden-Württemberg. It's in the hand of a big consumer organization. They work together with the ministry and with sciences, and it, seems not to be a good idea. Useful disclosure, not more, but smart and very trustful. Trust, I think that was maybe, for me at least, the most important point of the previous speakers. Try really, because information is a credence good itself. Who signals the quality of the information? That's about the same independent evaluation, in particular if you have conflicting views. And I also think that there's no way not to involve and not to engage citizens. And I heard your frustrating note about those, 129 people? This is how it is, but there's other ways how to do it. In Scandinavia, there is some experience with consumer conferences or consumer boards. And let's be a little bit more creative about those things. And this is from the Academy of Technical Sciences representative survey that we just did. And again, in German, it's about asking people about whether citizens should co-decide in future technologies. And if you look at the green parts of the circle, these are people who said yes, we definitely should do that. The blue are, they're irrelevant, and the red said no, it's, should not, it's not of our business. So I think this is, at least for one country, it's pretty strong, and I would love to see more of such data from other countries. Thanks so much.
Would like to open the floor for questions. There's, I think, a lot. Yes.
Hi, I'm Roberta Fabrizi. I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield looking at GMOs and Brexit in the media. By hearing you talking about the information model, I immediately made the association with the idea of value-free science. I was wondering whether you thought that having value management, so being transparent about scientists' values, could make information better.
Making it, I'm not
could
sure
I ask
I'm aware.
you, Lucia, to collect some questions and then give
Okay,
you the
but I
floor.
didn't really understand the question.
Ah, okay.
I don't think I'm aware of that, what you just cited.
In the plenary session, basically, we talked about how we sometimes think that science needs to be value-free, to be unbiased, but maybe we need to manage.
Got it.
Yeah?
Yes.
Other questions? I see here a question. It's actually nudging, nothing else than a form of manipulation. There's a question. Another question is, and I think that would be then enough, and then I give you the floor, is communications by governments have a strong inherent bias because those in power want to keep it. Do you have suggestions to help neutralize this?
Which biases? Sorry, I didn't really hear you.
Maybe then, can someone explain?
Nico.
No, just repeat it. Which was it, about a specific bias or just about bias?
Biases in general, in fact.
Okay.
Because, of course, they have a certain purpose of communication. And
yes, here we go. Okay.
It's a bit, yeah.
Let me then start with the last one about biases. Yes, we know something about debiasing. First of all, you have to make people aware that there is biases, because people usually don't know. We usually think that we do follow a rational model, that we do follow up our preferences, and if we don't, we know it. This is simply empirically not true, at least not all of the time. So making people aware of biases is step one. And then it really depends. There's a lot of research on debiasing, how you can do that. You can, try to, for instance, have someone, an extra safeguard who is specifically only watching the biases. That is done, for instance, in citizens' juries. Then you can do a lot with framing, using the same problem, the same decision, but posing it in a completely different phrase, like loss or loss frame or gain frame. And then when you see that in both cases you would make the same decision, that would be an unbiased decision. There's more to it. I'm here the whole day, happy to talk to the person. The second question is on value-free science. You know what? I don't think there is value-free science. I think, and this is talking with Gunnar Myrdal, what we have to do is to make it explicit. We have to say explicitly what is our value base, as we have to disclose whether we get people also money from industry. We should make that very, very explicit, and because in the end, only choosing a research question is already a value statement somehow. I'm actually looking also at your, this discussion with the fake journals and the retraction rates. Someone showed the retraction rates this morning. It is scary and it's not good, and there's a lot of sloppy research also in my field. One of the big names just had to retract, I think, 15 papers, which is a big thing. On the other hand, I would like to ask you, at least those of you who are researchers, who's actually protecting the researchers? I work a lot with climate researchers. I'm doing research on obesity, for instance, childhood obesity. We're under attack. We're also under attack. We're harassed. There's no, that would be a very good thing actually for this European science officer, chief officer, to take on, because there's no one out there. There is no one out there, because only the people who give the money for the grant, they're responsible. Okay, I had to say that.
Okay, something about the nudging, whether that's a form of manipulation? You want to say something?
Regulation?
Is a form of manipulation?
Manipulation, oh yes, that's a very good question. Okay, first we have to define what manipulation is. I think it's a scale, and when you take the different type of nudges, which are like, behavioral, it's things like making things easier, more transparent, but also using defaults. They're on a scale, and there is nudges that are, maybe they might even, some people might say they tend to be manipulative, but it's a very, very small part of those nudges that are used. The big safeguard is that when you use it in regulatory nudges, and there's a big difference whether nudging is used by corporations or by kind of, public officials or regulatory nudges, they must be transparent. They must be transparent. There's no way around it. And we have just been developing something that we call a little big mouthy, a Bill of Rights of nudging. And so we have come up with a list of 10 variables, of 10 things that must be there if governments to use nudges and nudging. So no way, as a governmentally, public policymaker, it must be transparent, and there must be also, when you talk about defaults, defaults are pretty strong, and they're very robust, and they work very effectively. You have to tell people in one way or the other. On the other hand, there's almost no situation in life, also not this one, you're sitting there, I'm sitting here, I'm standing here. All situations, all choice situations are somehow staged. There is a choice architect always who creates choice situations with a specific aim in mind. The question is not whether this is okay, but who does it, based on which legitimation, and is the goal legitimate. So it has a lot to do with legitimacy of the goal. If it's only commercial, it's legitimate, but it's not really something that policymakers should try to help.
Thank you very much, Lucia. I would like to invite you all for the coffee break, and I would like to ask you to be here at 10:30 as we will start then sharp. Thank you very much.